Hi everyone. I'm just going to introduce today, I'm Emily Osier, I'm one of the IMAS seminar coordinators and a member of ResCom. We run these monthly events and the idea is to break down some of the more complex science we do, find the relevancies between different groups of researchers within IMAS, different disciplines, tackle a substantial sort of public issue and show the range of sciences that IMAS brings to it. So thanks for coming today, a delayed one but nonetheless a very interesting one. So for all of us as researchers, we know that we need to be pitching to the people. There's all sorts of drivers for that. If you're totally strategic, it's about ARC and the way they measure impact these days and engagement. But it's also simply about making your research relevant. And that question of pitching to the people and why we put this mass seminar together today was to think about all of the different mechanisms and different ways we should do that. There's no one pro forma or template for this question of how to achieve science impact and how to pitch to whoever the people are that you need to pitch. And this is the type of information we think about the practice of our research that we need to be sharing with each other. So science communication, I mean, it's such a massive area and causes all sorts of moments of frustration and misunderstanding. But I think the first point to kick off on is we're pretty sure who we are as scientists to be doing the communicating, but we're not often very good about thinking who are we communicating to. So I use the term pitching to the people a little bit ironically in this title. Which people? And perhaps in fact they're the people, as Catriona will probably cover, who may have actually identified the problem that you're attempting to address in the first instance with your research. Or you may be the generator of some pure research that you then do need to communicate and make the public relevance of your findings relevant. Or the people may be funders, or the people may be supporters of your institution, let alone your research. So I think when we're talking about this question of pitching to the people, the first question, of course, is which people, who, before, perhaps even before which science. I work quite a lot in the field of science technology studies or science policy, and I find this fascinating. This is how we've traditionally approached this question. We go and generate science, we issue media releases, it gets through to the general public. But we only have to take the climate debate, the climate change debate, to understand that this deficit model, the assumption that the general public is ignorant and we need to fill in the gaps with our science knowledge to know how erroneous that assumption is, and it's not going to do our science any good either to continue to pursue it. So we're, just the reference to the climate change debate, and I actually quite like this one because it probably reflects me and my inability to operate the tech systems in this room about microphones. Anyway, but finally, I also love this slide because we always often think that we're the generators of this incredibly insightful, ground-shattering knowledge, and that in terms of policy and making a difference to decision-making, we think our science is really a massive part of the answer. But if you really think about what's going on in the ground and the people to whom we're pitching, they're taking science in amongst all those other forms and streams of information. And I think there's really something to think about in how are we pitching to make what our science message is relevant amongst that mix of other pitches, if you like. So today we've assembled a wide-ranging group of people, and with the exception of Andrew, who I'll mention in a minute, none are actually direct specialists in science communication. They are science practitioners who've come to undertake a significant amount of communication in the science that they do. We're going to start off with Tracey, who's a fisheries scientist at Fisheries and Aquaculture Centre of IMAS, who works a lot with, amongst other groups, recreational fishers, and he's looking at changing practice, how you use information and science products to actually, or co-produce some of that knowledge to actually elicit changes in the practices of recreational fishers. So moving beyond just communication to fill a knowledge gap, but communication to then engender behavioural change. Then we've got Catriona Macleod, who's also within Fisheries and Aquaculture, and she's talking about the actual controversy that sometimes you are communicating within. And the way that environmental science in itself can be the subject of controversy, but also environmental science coupled with social science can actually unpack some of the controversy about the messages and some of the issues going on. But how do you, what are your options? What are your mechanisms and platforms for tackling that controversy? And I can attest to one of Catriona's very successful strategies is have a lot of coffee with a lot of people. Sorry if I've stolen your thunder. Finally, we've got Andrew Rhodes, and it's fantastic to have Andrew here. He's the first of our professional staff that we've included in these presentations, and we want to do more of it because he has significant expertise. In his case, and he was very clear about it, his pitch is to the potential supporters of IMAS and what IMAS does. His pitch is not to convince people of the content of our science messages, but that they should be listening to us and funding us, essentially. So it's a very different approach to the pitch, but strategically, politically, incredibly important, and I think it helps us as science practitioners to know what that pitch is and what he's doing. So enough of me. I'm going to hand over to Sean. We'll have a little bit of a technological moment, which I hope I don't fail, as we transfer between speakers.
Right. So I can shut yours. I can open mine.
Do you want to mic up?
I think I'm mic'd up. Can people hear me okay up the back? Yeah. Cool. All right, thank you, Emily. So before I get started, I just wanted to acknowledge the collaborators on this project. So this is a broader project being basically facilitated by IMAS, but we've got partners in the Australian Government through the Department of Agriculture and Water Resources. A lot of the funds are coming from FRDC, and we're also working with the Australian Recreational Fishing Foundation. So the work many of us do affects a whole range of end users, and these, you know, as Emily has just said, their needs are very diverse, their aspirations can be very different, whether we're talking about just the general community or specific user groups. So a lot of the work I've been doing over the last few years, and as Emily said, I'm a fisheries biologist ecologist, not a communicator, but is in the space of recreational fishing. And this particular group is also very diverse and complex as I'm learning along the way. So if you think about recreational fisheries and the way they're traditionally managed, it's usually around some form of limiting catch for sustainable stocks, and also trying to make sure that there's equity in the resource, access to the resource. It's a fairly blunt tool, so a lot of this is done through catch restrictions, so bag limits or possession limits. Usually there's very little information that goes into making those decisions and how those fisheries are managed. As we're seeing more studies being done looking at catch, we're finding out that where traditionally we thought that recreational fisheries may not have a big impact on stock, the cumulative effect actually can be quite great, and we're seeing that in some fisheries, recreational sector is taking equal or greater amounts than some of the commercial sectors. This can lead to a lot of conflict, one in terms of having that information out for one or two stocks. One sector might go, well, you're taking all the fish and we're not, and there's a lot of issues and conflict that arise from one, having that information, but more so from the lack of information or the lack of completeness of that information, where there's a lot of speculation and people sort of suggesting, well, you know, in that fishery you're doing this, so that's probably the same for every other fishery, and that's often not the case. So, as I said, it leads to a lot of conflict. The other thing, as I said, with the recreational sector is there is not only that between sector conflict, between, say, the commercials and the recreational sector, but even internally within the recreational sector, it's very diverse. So here you have a few different images of recreational fishing activity. So this is trophy fishing, where they've caught a fish, they may be weighing it in for a competition or for you know, a world record. We've got someone over here releasing a fish. Someone's caught a fish here and turned it into dinner. Here we've got three mates that are just enjoying the social aspects of recreational fishing. But this is very complex and dynamic as well. These guys might have eaten the fish, so it turns into that. This guy might want to keep one, he might want to release one, and he might want a trophy. So it's very diverse within the sector, and there's a lot of scope for conflict and misunderstanding. So one of the things that definitely doesn't happen very well in the recreational fishing space at the moment is the understanding of the human dimension. So as I've just explained, there's a lot of sources of conflict, a lot of different drivers, and we're starting to see that you really need people to be educated and engaged and understood for that management to be truly effective. And I quite like this quote, that there is a contemporary realisation that recreational fisheries management is as much about people and conflict management as it is about actually managing the stock. So if we take, for example, the southern bluefin tuna fishery, this is a highly iconic species. It's gone through a period of commercial overfishing a couple of decades ago, and we're seeing some rebuilding. And it's also a really important target species for the recreational sector. But there's more the way the fishery is managed leads to, again, a lot of conflict through misunderstanding and misinformation. It's quite a complex system. So the fishery is targeted by a range of countries in the Southern Hemisphere. So it's managed at an international level by a regional fisheries management organisation. Then they allocate some catch to the member countries. So, for example, Australia gets a proportion of the catch. That's all allocated at the moment to the commercial sector only, and that's managed by the Australian Fisheries Management Authority. And that's very stringent, so they've got very strict catch reporting rules through the commercial sector. But as I said, we also have the recreational sector there as well that have a real interest in this fishery. And that's actually managed at a state level, and again using those fairly blunt objectives of catch restrictions and bag limits. One of the big things to note here is there is no mandatory reporting of catch from this fishery. So whilst we have the commercial sector being managed at a very strict level, the recreational sector is almost, for want of a better term, fairly much open access. So again, this creates a lot of conflict between resource users and also a lot of misunderstanding from within the recreational sector. So quite recently there was actually an obligation at the international level that all CCSBT members actually have to report all sources of mortality to the RFMO, and that includes recreational catches. So one, there is a need for more information in this fishery to do it effectively, so we need to look at understanding the catch, and there is work happening in that space. But also we need to actually inform, say, the rec sector, who are quite diverse. We've got some people that have been in the fishery for years and others that haven't. They're seeing things like, as the fishery is rebuilding, 10 years ago there may have only been a few bluefin around, now there's a lot of them. So their perception is that things are great and there's no issue, we can just take what we want, we don't need to manage it. But if they were educated and knew the background, that there's this shifting baseline, that things actually have still got a long way to go in this fishery, and we all have a role to play as stewards. So what do we know about the recreational fishery for SBT? As I said, for a species of its status, not a lot. We have a fairly limited understanding of participation rates from the recreational sector and what the individual drivers are. There are some that like to catch it to eat. There are others that think they shouldn't be kept and they should be released. There's been, that I know of, one survey done looking at that, but it was a snapshot survey. We've also had some snapshot surveys of the catch in various states, but not a holistic understanding of a national harvest estimate. As I said, there is work happening in that space at the moment. And where my work fit into this picture was I did a 3-year project looking at best handling practices to increase post-release survival of the fish. So the things the fishers can do to improve their practices to reduce the impact on unnecessary mortality, as in if they're releasing a fish, is it surviving or dying? But also looking at the animal welfare side of it as well. So there are things that they can do to reduce animal welfare impacts. But how do we actually convey these messages to improve stewardship? So as a fisheries biologist, I did what we all do, and we produce a report, a nice lengthy report. I also went on, because I work for a university, I produced a paper. The chances of getting the recreational sector to read either of those things is fairly limited. So then I went on and go, all right, I'm going to do the right thing, science communicator. I produced a code of practice, which has 8 pages, some background on what they should do, and a little bit of information about why, to educate them, which is great. So you can fill a trough, but leading a horse to water is another thing. So we put that out. We put it out through the main communication mediums we have. We put it out through the department. I think it's on the IMAS website. But actually getting the recreational fishers to engage with that information, I feel, was fairly limited. So recently I've had the opportunity to take this to the next level, and it was it sort of evolved. So my career has evolved from a research scientist into this comm space. Through that project, I made some really good connections with some influencers in the recreational sector, so people with big social media profiles, TV shows, etc. So I kind of started to develop this relationship and utilise those guys to help try and get the message out. Science as communicators, look, I think we do definitely play a role, and Emily touched on this before, but the study of human dimensions in relation to fisheries is an area of scientific investigation, so I think we have a role to play in this. And what we're trying to do is understand, predict and ultimately affect the thoughts and behaviour towards natural environments. So basically improving stewardship from this sector where there's a lot of conflict, there's a lot of misperception, there's a lot of misunderstanding. We're also looking at basically providing some of this information to help with the conflict resolution between sectors, between researchers and sectors and management and sectors, and also acknowledging that recreational fishing does have an important role to play in terms of its socio-economic benefits. So from here, we've basically come up with what we're considering a movement. So we've produced our code of practice. 10 fishers may have read it, that's great. But we've realised that that's not really getting the message through and it's not really influencing the people. So working with the partners, we've come up with what we're calling the Tuna Champions, Bluefin Forever. We've got a top Sydney marketing company that are helping us with the branding. This isn't it. This is my very naive Adobe Photoshop work here. They're currently working on the branding for us now. And you can see if we then look at the structure of how we're going to educate and communicate this back to the sector, that code of practice is only a very small part of the whole story. So it gets quite complicated in terms of what are we educating on. All right, so the code of practice, we had some key topics. So catching the fish, handling the fish, retaining the fish, preparing the fish, releasing the fish, tagging the fish, and also the need for the survey. As I said, a lot of the fishers go, we don't catch much. Me and my mates only catch 10 fish a year. What are you talking about? I'm not considering the 1,000 other boats that are out there. So it's education around all those factors. We then look at the extension phase of that. So as I said, we've got a branding company involved. So that's continuity of theme, that idea of you're part of something, you're part of a team, that team recognition. We'll probably look at actual merchandising as well, because the rec fishers love to have colourful branded shirts saying they're part of something. So we're tapping into the psyche of this particular group. We're looking at champions of change. So they're our influencers in each of the subsectors within the fishery. So there's charter operators, there's TV celebrities, there's the state governments, and there's the researchers that all have a role to play. We'll be doing expert presentations, we'll be using boat ramp signage, multimedia exposure through a whole range of mini clips, YouTube clips, that will all be housed in this sort of central hub of a web page. What's quite exciting about this is we also have one of the TV celebrities has been funded to do a 1-hour documentary that will go to free-to-air TV, and he's interviewing people that have been involved in both the commercial and recreational sectors for years, and it's about that sort of the keystone to the whole project, giving that background information so that people can understand that this fishery has gone through a lot of ebbs and flows before they've got engaged in it. We also have a broad steering committee, and this is an important part of these communication strategies, is at a high level you need to have the agencies involved that have a vested interest in seeing it, in the outcomes of this project. We're also looking at strategic links. So, one thing that the department's quite interested in is engaging with the commercial sector and the rec sector, to trying to move more towards our fishery rather than it's theirs or mine. Again, it's that conflict resolution idea. So we're doing things like, well, the commercial guys spend a lot of time preparing their fish for the Japanese market. A lot of the rec guys don't. They sort of knock it on the head and go, well, it's kind of cat food. I'm not interested. But we can actually learn from the commercial sector, get them in some of these YouTube clips to show how they take the time to prepare the fish so it's a really, really good quality product. Ultimately, hopefully that will reduce wastage so people aren't throwing fillets of fish out of the freezer that they weren't really that interested in eating in the first place. We've also engaged with Paul Worsling, who some of you may know, who is a rec fishing identity, and anyone that follows football, Patrick Dangerfield. So they're, Patrick and Paul have started a clothing brand, and they're very interested in aligning our brand with theirs. So we're actually tapping into their networks of millions of people to help spread our message and get it out there. And they're also influencers people that look up to. So we can actually get the rec fishers to go, I actually want to be part of this. I want to be part of that team. More broadly, obviously, we have to have a whole range of goals as well. And probably the big thing here that's a challenge, and this probably leads into Catriona's story, where you're talking about conflict. There is a lot of resource user conflict in this fishery between the commercials and the recs. And we've consciously made a point the whole way through that this message is very static. Responsible fishing is as relevant tomorrow as it is in 20 years. The management is going to be potentially fairly dynamic. There's going to be a lot of change. There may be more resources given to the rec sector or the commercial sector, but we don't want that to undermine the value of the actual positive message through responsible fishing and this stewardship. So bottom line is, it's complicated, learning on the run, but it's a really interesting field, and I think we all have a very important role to play in it. Thank you.
Thanks, Sean. We'll save up those questions for the end for everybody. Thanks. And so now it's Catriona Macleod.
Yeah, money. Do I need the microphone for the? Yeah, probably do for the links. Okay, I'll talk about me. You got it? Good on you. Right to the top. Yep. Okay. Cool. Okay. Thank you. Hi. I'm a little different. I'm not going to talk about a specific project. I'm going to talk more about communication of science and how I've come to view that over many years of working in fairly complicated or potentially contentious spaces. So I'm an environmental impact scientist, a benthic ecologist by background, so I tend to work by nature in an area that there is a bit of conflict, environmental impact assessment. The three areas I work in most are in mariculture, metals in the environment, and because of both of those, I work a lot in the management sphere. In terms of mariculture, you'll probably be aware, unless you've had your head completely in the sand for the last year or so, we work a lot with salmon farming in Tasmania, and that's getting a bit contentious out there at the moment. Not everybody likes it. So when you're in that space, your science is very hotly debated and people have very strong views about what it means and how you use it. That's very challenging for a scientist. How do you get the reality of the situation out there? In terms of heavy metal contamination, I've worked for the last 15 years or so with heavy metals in the Derwent. Beautiful spot, but again, there's a lot of contention there with industry inputs into the system resulting in some fairly environmentally degraded areas and habitats. And people feel very strongly about these things. But it's complicated and it's contentious, and that's where it comes into the management side of things. So in terms of management, none of these systems we're managing uniquely for one species or one activity. They're all interactive, and all of those people will have different views of what your science means, how good your science is, that's a fairly big one at the moment, and how they can use it to better inform decisions for them or for the government or managers. So we've got over this side the research tying into a whole load of management processes, so catchment issues, understanding environmental processes and flows. That's the nuts and bolts of what makes us, the questions we answer as scientists, which is where I came from. I'm not a communicator, as Em pointed out. But on this other side, you've got, well, how do we use that to manage and monitor for the best outcomes of the system as a whole? There's a whole load of individual users who may have very particular perceptions about how things should be managed, and you've got to be able to communicate your science across that. Increasingly so, for one of my bugbears is we used to have some very good science communicators. We used to have science journalists. Not so much anymore, mainly because the resources aren't there to support them. So as a scientist, I'm a benthic ecologist. I'm now often called on to say, well, what's the ecological significance of your science? But also they start pushing me into areas around my views and decisions around economic stuff, societal stuff. And it's very easy for me to wander into that space and give them my opinion, but it might not be a very well-informed opinion. So that's one of the key things to remember is it's fine to have an opinion on some of these things, but from your perspective, it may not be a very well-informed opinion. Okay, so who are we actually talking to? This is who we talk to as scientists all the time, other scientists. And no matter who we're talking to, that's who we're talking to. We tend to be that. We talk to scientists, we know the language, we understand the way to do it, and so we talk like that. And I see it in presentations with community, with industry all the time. You talk to them like you're showing off how cool your science is. Look at my great results. I'm going to tell you some acronyms and some really big words because I'm a clever person. Doesn't work with the next group. Some of these do, some of these get it, some of them are actually very clever scientists, but I can almost guarantee they'll start to switch off pretty quickly because, as Emily put it up, they've got a whole range of other people talking to them and a whole range of other priorities. If you don't get to the point quick, they're gone. Industry, it's not very good. I couldn't find any salmon farmers. But there's a huge range out there, too, with the vested interest. And some of them will have a strong a science background. They'll have a knowledge of your topic area. So the other side, you don't want to talk down to people because then you'll offend them and they'll switch off just as well. So a very good thing is if in the first 3-4 minutes they start doing this, you've lost them. The public, and that's hugely diverse. And they are one of the most difficult to talk science to communicate science to, but one of the most interested, and also from my perspective, one of the most rewarding when it actually comes to, because if you can help these people understand the issues they're concerned about, they're passionate about, and what you're doing as a scientist towards it, that's very rewarding stuff. So how do we do this? I'm sure I'm probably going to step into Andrew's area here again. I'm not telling you anything that you probably haven't already heard or seen before, but it is something that I just think it's so worth reinforcing. You need to know what the audience want to know. It's all very well you standing up there telling them all about your science, but if that's not what they're interested in, not what they came there to hear about, you're missing the point. Having said that, don't forget to bear in mind what you do want to tell them. I hear a lot of people give talks and they spend, a good one with students, they often spend a lot of time on their methods, and then right at the end, and we found blah, 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 ran out of time. That's the bit people, you want to tell them. I mean, don't get me wrong, you need to tell them your methods too, but the two of those should be right at the forefront when you think about what do they want to know, what do I want to tell them, and how do I do that most effectively. Keep it simple and to the point. If they want to know what time it is, tell them what time it is, not all the rest of the blurb. Complicated and contentious. Big one that's, I've come from some very contentious conversations. Be truthful and be complete. Do not tell people, oh yes, I think I'll just tell you this because that will get you off my back. Doesn't work. Take the time it needs. And that's a big one, and I'll say that from the salmon industry stuff that we've been involved in. When it's contentious, when it's complicated, you can't deal with it quickly. You have to, in the whole communication, make the time to do it properly. And don't be afraid to say you don't know. That's, if you don't, they respect you for that. You can't know everything. You give another person a chance to tell them what they know, but that's very important. Twitter and Facebook, really amazing technologies for getting information out there. Can be a little difficult when you get into complicated and contentious because of the bite-sized piece you're offering. But it's a very good vehicle to get information out there. Firm believer in the old book side of things, reports. And this is Emily stole my thunder. One of the things that this is probably the one really little gem of knowledge from my years, is we do all the reports, we do all of the manuscripts, we do all of the other stuff, but sometimes you just need to sit down, take time with a cup of coffee and a biscuit and go through it with them from their perspective. And this was in some of the Mac Harbour stuff that we did with the community up there. We gave a 20-minute presentation and a 4-hour cup of coffee. Everybody got a chance to ask the questions that they want, so do not underestimate the cuppa. Tell the whole story. The point there is, again, we often, as scientists, we have, this is how it works. But the real world does not have a scientific brain, and that's another little gem of wisdom I've discovered along the way. We have a very specific training that we've been given as scientists, whereby we interrogate a question. We look at it, we take all of the... Just checking you weren't running out of time for you, Andrew. We have a very specific brain. So we are trained when we get a piece of information and we go away and research it. We look for the stuff that supports our ideas, but also the things that go against our point of view. Now, often in the general community, that's not the case. They will surround their idea and their issue with all the information that supports it. So they don't often actually have this sort of really clear path around something, and you have to help walk them around the story. And yes, why they have to take into account the stuff that may not support their argument or their point of view. That's why it takes 4 hours to have that cup of coffee. How to tell the story. You've touched on this already, so I think it might be the same reports. Maybe not. I don't think so. there's the reports, there's the papers. That's the nuts and bolts, the bread and butter, the things we're judged on as scientists. And they're really important for communicating with ourselves and for recording what we've done. But perhaps not so good at the communication in controversial or situations with the public. This is some stuff that actually Em and I were involved in, where we can actually take some of that hard science and digest it down into forms that make it easier for the public to engage with and find the issues that they're... It's like our website. Our personal website, we find our way around really quickly because we know all the bits of it. But you go to some other department's website and it's never as easy because you just don't have the language. And that's where I'd say some of these reports are. We should be looking at the kind of language through. There's media articles that we can do that synthesize it very snappily. We can put it on our website, and that's a great resource, so long as we can get it simply and currently up there. We can talk to people like we're doing now. I actually think this is one of the best ways with many of our stakeholders, because I think, as Sean says, it's hard to get them to go to a website. They've got to be really impassioned to get to that stage. These are the ability to capture that much broader group of people. And then I am going to finish on a platform, an exciting platform that we're using now. Most of the stuff I've said is common sense and probably fairly old school when I'm suggesting you go back to a cup of coffee. But this is one we did recently for Mac Harbour. Now, the link's at the bottom. I won't go through all of it, but and it won't work unless I hit on it, apparently. There we go. And this is one we did recently about Mac Harbour because we had so much interest in it.
Is a large and unique system to work in.
Putting together something like this, short and sharp,
size, it's 6 times the
to
size
the point
of Sydney
around
Harbour.
the issue you're dealing with.
It's characterised by a deep central basin and this really narrow sill at the entrance to the ocean, and they're really important characteristics for how we see.
And hopefully Jeff will pop up and you'll see just
strong, big freshwater inflows
real
from the Gordon
and
River
personal and honest he is.
The harbour is what we call highly stratified. That means because of those strong
But
freshwater flows,
I won't go through it all.
It's got a thick freshwater layer on the top.
It's 9 minutes.
And it's got this dense
so Andrew
marine seawater underneath. Now, what that means for the system is...
Okay. So the big one there is there's a lot of new technologies in terms of communicating. But ultimately, when it comes to contentious or complex stuff, I don't think you can get away from the face-to-face. I think that is what engenders trust, particularly in contentious issues. I find in a lot of the things we are discussing, particularly the heavy metals, the salmon issue, people actually want to get right up to me, look me in the eye and hear if they trust what I'm saying them, if they can believe me. And yeah, there's no getting around that, and I've had a lot of cups of coffee in the last year or so. You can tell. Just have to stop having bickies with them. Okay, so that's it from me. I'll let Andrew go. We can talk at the end.
Too many bits of technology. Hi. As Emily mentioned, I'm not a scientist, hopeless with science. I've spent a long time as a journalist and most of the last 20 years as a political media advisor and communications advisor to governments. At IMAS, I'm the communications manager, so I spend a lot of time trying to persuade people they should communicate at all. This is a already persuaded audience, so I don't need to do that today. But these are the reasons that IMAS and the university more broadly communicate in general terms. To me, the top 5 are strategic reasons to communicate. The bottom one's a nice extra incentive for researchers. But these are the reasons we're doing it, to get reputation, to attract students, to keep funders happy, and to inform debates and hopefully make a difference with the science. But as we're already preaching to the converted here, I won't spend too much time on that one. That one? Yep. When I came to IMAS a couple of years ago, I worked on a communications plan with the senior management here. It's a communications plan designed to support the institution's strategic plan. The strategic plan has a whole bunch of goals in it. From a communications perspective, the first thing I wanted to do was to make sure that we were communicating strategically, that we were trying to achieve something. Communications is lots of fun. You can have a great time making videos, writing media releases, holding events, designing web pages, chatting with people, watching yourself on TV, counting media hits, working out what the advertising space ratio return of an article you got in the paper is. You can get really distracted by the mechanics of it, and lots of media people do get distracted by the mechanics of it, producing reports on how many media hits and that sort of stuff you've had. My view is that if you're not communicating strategically, then you may well be wasting your time. You might not be, but unless you have a strategy, you won't know whether you're achieving something meaningful or not. Putting together a media strategy isn't a dark art. It's not a particularly complicated thing. Emily and Catriona have both referred to how you do it. To me, the first thing is to work out who you're communicating with. So I always write long lists of all the possible people we're communicating with. In the IMAS communications plan, which this is the front page of, I listed everyone from the university hierarchy on down, moving outwards to industry, government, media, community groups, NGOs. They're all in there. The next step I try and work out is what they actually already think or know about what it is that you're communicating. If they already know what you're doing and they're on side, then you don't need to communicate very much to them. If they don't know anything about it, then you've got a bit more of a communications challenge. If they know about you and don't like you or don't support you, then you have a very big communications challenge. Once you've kind of established those things, the rest flows. You develop messages. So in the case of IMAS, the messages that we've developed that I wanted to get across particularly were that what we're doing here is world-class. And so one of the ways we get that across is it's written here on the front page of the strategic plan and our main brochure. It's on our website. World-class is a word I use in a lot of our media stuff, media releases. It's about repetition, as I used to say to politicians. When they're sick of saying something, after about 100 times, the audience is only starting to hear it for the first time. So it's about repetition. The other message we had was one about that we're making a difference, that we're kind of part of a sector here that is contributing to Tasmania and making a difference to the Tasmanian community. Coincidentally, both of those messages are things that the previous Vice-Chancellor used to say. One of the things I like about messaging is if you're saying to someone something that they already think, then they're more likely to agree with it. So I liked both of the messages the previous VC had about being world-class, about being part of an important sector and making a difference. So I'll use those a lot. From then on, you start working out what activities you're going to do. Is it going to be a media release? Are you going to have a media event? Are you going to have a website? Are you going to have something through social media? It kind of flows from there. Like I said, it's not a dark art. It's fairly common sense. It's fairly straightforward, working out what you want to say and who you want to say it to. One of the things I've already touched on is the need to be strategic. Next slide. A lot of times we're pushing messages that kind of have a big audience. So for IMAS, a lot of our funding, a lot of our support comes from governments, from politicians. So I've got some principles there that I think are worth keeping in mind when you're dealing with politicians particularly and governments more generally. One of the first things I did when I came here was I did a lot of research into what the politicians who are in charge of the purse strings that we get the money through in government, what they knew and what they thought about IMAS, as I said at the start. You can find that out in all sorts of ways. If you need to send someone a message, you need to know what they currently know. With politicians, you can find out from their media releases, from what they've said in the paper. You can find out by researching Hansard what they've said in Parliament. Coincidentally, when I did that here, we had a new state government here. I used to work for the previous one, and I went and looked at what all the state government ministers had said about IMAS in the previous years. What I discovered is that none of them had said anything about IMAS, other than when the building was being proposed, one of them said that this should be a hotel, not a science site, and scientists should be down at Kingston. that's obviously an interesting communications challenge. So one of the things, having done that research, was that it was important for me that IMAS communicated in a way with the local politicians who are now in government who weren't that engaged with IMAS. They hadn't given the money in the first place, as the previous government had. They hadn't really been engaged in the process. They hadn't really been to a lot of events here, as the former ones had. So we developed messaging about, the world-class thing. Obviously, if you can get politicians to start saying things like, we have world-class researchers in Tasmania, then they're more likely to support you. So that was a good thing to push out, this message that we have a world-class thing worth nurturing in Hobart. I think when you're dealing with politicians, when you're dealing with governments, an important thing is to treat them with respect. A lot of people have a dim view of politicians. I've spent a lot of time working with them. I have a lot of respect for politicians. They work very hard. They generally went into politics because they wanted to help, they wanted to make a contribution. They generally care about things that people come to them, policies and those sorts of things. They generally want to help and do the best they can. They might have different views from you and from other politicians about how to do it, but they're generally coming from a good place. If you can spend some time with them, talk to them, get messages to them in any way you can, whether it's through the newspaper, social media, documents they might read, then they will pay attention. I think bipartisanship is very important when you're dealing with governments and politicians. The university's policy when we invite a politician to an event at the university is that we invite all of them, state and federal, local, council, everyone. And I think that's a very good and sensible policy that we should follow, because apart from anything else, you never know when the mob that you're ignoring will come into government and you'll need to start being nice to them. So I think we should be nice to them all the time, at all levels. The final one, influencers. Often it's hard to get to politicians. None of us gets to pick up the phone and talk to the Prime Minister, or generally we don't get to send him a letter, although he has been in this building, and so have a couple of the former ones. But you can get to other people around them. You can send messages to their advisors who read papers, who watch TV stories, who go on social media. The people who are important to them, industry, industry lobby groups, community groups. If those people have a point of view, if they are saying to these ministers, oh yes, those people down there are doing great work, they're doing world-class research here, they're really worth valuing and keeping, then that's a good thing. So messaging isn't just necessarily direct to the people who you've targeted, but you have them in mind when you're targeting. So in some ways with the previous Vice-Chancellor, when I kept on saying that we were doing world-class stuff, which was repeating what he already thought, he then, and I'm not claiming credit for that, when he lobbies people, when he goes to talk to ministers, when he goes to talk to community groups, he was then repeating those messages too. So in effect, you're making the people who you're messaging, they become proselytisers of your message as well. They become diplomats for you. I think I'm about to explode. Just finally, one of the things that's been important to IMAS and the rest of the local Antarctic and marine sector in recent years has been this funding cliff that we face with ACRC's funding about to run out, Gateway Partnerships funding about to run out. So we've been part of a push, that message I mentioned earlier about how IMAS is part of a very important sector that's part of the Tasmanian economy and doing great work for Tasmania. And a lot of people have been doing that. It's been happening, the leaders of these organisations have been doing it face-to-face with politicians. It's been something that has been done through communicators in the media. So when recently the state government brought out its first Antarctic Gateway statement, policy, whatever it's called, and so we're in it, which is great. And ACE is mentioned through it, IMAS is mentioned through it, IMOS, AAD. So I'd like to think that we're in a good place now. People recognise us, all the politicians. There's currently a federal parliamentary inquiry going on into funding for the sector. And I'd like to think that communications has helped be part of that. But as with any strategy, it's something that has to happen across the board. So communications is only one part of it. Having coffee with people, having meetings with them, sending them documents is another part of it. So I'd like to think that communications is something worth doing, is something worth considering. And that's me.